Hi, this is Jerry Amernick. I'm the author of the new book, Babe Ruth, A Superstar's Legacy, which is available on Amazon and at the website baberuthlegacy.com. And we're back with another in the series of Babe Ruth Legacy interviews, where we speak to people who are, in one way or another, preserving the legacy of Mr. Ruth. And I want to start off this interview with just a short passage from the book. Babe Ruth was born February 6, 1895 in a tenement house in Baltimore. The house is preserved as the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum a couple of streets over from Camden Yards, where the Orioles play. Right outside the entrance to the park is a courtyard displaying the numbers of retired Oriole greats: Earl Weaver, Brooks Robinson, Cal Ripken Jr., Frank Robinson, Jim Palmer, and Eddie Murray. And make no mistake, these aluminum numbers commemorating those Oriole stars are impressive. They stand about 4 feet high. But the statue of the young Babe Ruth, erected in 1996, is what presides over this courtyard of baseball royalty. The statue rises to a height of 16 feet. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Susan Luery, who is the sculptor who made that incredible work of art. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
So, this statue went up, I guess, in '96, and I wonder if maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, and how you got the commission to make this bronze sculpture.
Well, okay, going back to the origination of the project, I guess the powers that be in Baltimore City and the Babe Ruth Museum were looking for a start to create this big monument. At the time, I was someone who had a career of doing fine art, figurative sculpture that was mostly shown in galleries. My background is that I studied in Italy, and I studied with a sculptor who did great monumental sculpture. Alberto Spadapani did the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier for the Italian National Republic, and the statue of Leonardo for the town of Vinci. And as a very young girl, I was super excited to be invited to work alongside of him and learn monuments.
And your works, as I understand, are in public and private museum collections right around the world. Is that right?
Yes, including this Babe Ruth monument is actually included in the Smithsonian Museum Archive of American Art.
Right.
But so I guess my background was really as a figurative, more traditional romantic sculptor, not a baseball aficionado in any way, shape, or form. I was more interested in doing balletic type of sculptures, athletes that weren't necessarily current, but more the sense of the figure. And so when this city of Baltimore started looking for someone to do this sculpture, they sent out a request for proposals, and someone really nudged me and said, you should really try and get this job.
Okay, so we were talking about how you got the commission back in 1995, which was the centennial of Babe Ruth's birth, and you mentioned you were the only woman involved in this competition. So how did you actually get the job?
I did a smaller version of Babe Ruth after the swing, and then it was a pretty small piece. They had presentations from different sculptors, at which point I went to the Babe Ruth Museum, and I, along with other people I'm sure, made this presentation. And lo and behold, they gave me the job.
Wow.
And I was absolutely thrilled to get that job.
Okay. And then you started going to baseball games, I understand. Right.
Said to me, you got this job to do the Babe Ruth Monument? I have to take you to the ballpark. You've never been. And I was like, yeah. I knew nothing about baseball. I thought that everything was a point. I didn't know anything about runs, game or anything like that. So it was quite an education and quite an experience to go through this whole process of getting this incredible opportunity to sculpt this greatest icon and to learn all about his background. I read book after book about him and went to baseball games and did everything I could to educate myself in the subject, and spent a lot of time at the Babe Ruth Museum talking to people that work there that really gave me a lot of insight into what this was all about.
So you got to know Michael Gibbons, I guess.
I got to know Michael Gibbons and Greg Schwallenberg, and back then there were a few other people that worked there. I don't know what's ever happened to them because it's been a good 20 years, but it's been a while. But that was quite a new crew of people to meet that were so outside of the type of interest that I had.
Right.
So.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So tell us exactly how did you actually make the sculptor?
Okay. Well, the first thing that I did was I created a small-scale model of it that took me quite a while. I think that took the longest time, was to create the small-scale version of it, because that was actually the scale model that I used when I enlarged it to actually, the sculpture itself is 10.5 feet, and it's on a 5.5 foot tall pedestal.
Okay, yeah.
So I hired a model. I found someone who looked, in my opinion, pretty close to Babe Ruth.
And how did you find this person? Did you put an ad in the paper, or?
As I said, I had spent time in Italy with a monumentalist, and I didn't want to lose my ability at the time to speak some Italian, so I joined an Italian conversation group, and I was sitting there. It was only maybe 10 people, and we would get together once a week and pretend that we understood what we were talking about. And there was a fellow there looking at it, and I was thinking, he really looks like Babe Ruth. And and he never spoke Italian, not the entire time that he was at this group. So I said to him, I said, do you realize you look like Babe Ruth? And he said, am I supposed to be insulted by that? And I said, no, actually, a big favor if we could talk about it. So we went for coffee, and he explained that the only reason he was taking this class, or group rather, it seemed like a class, but it wasn't. He said the only reason he was there was to perfect his ability to pronounce Italian words, because he was an opera singer and a bricklayer.
Now that's quite a combination, an opera singer and a bricklayer. So he became your model for Babe Ruth.
And it was perfect, because bricklayers can only work when the weather's reasonably warm. And I started doing the model of Babe Ruth, I think it was around September, October, and his work was waning off. So he had the whole winter to model for me, and he had a grand operatic voice, and he could stand still, and so he was dressed up like Babe Ruth every day. We had historic uniforms made that looked exactly like the ones Ruth wore, and I was given the accoutrements from the Babe Ruth Museum, and Michael Carter, who was my model and muse, really, he stood and held that bat and the glove,
right,
and modeled me for 6 months.
Okay. Now, when I go on your website, there's a photo there of you standing beside the statue, I guess when you were working on it, and when you see that, you really sense the enormity of this work, how big it is. And you say the figure is actually 10 feet, or 10.5 feet, and on a base that makes it about 16 feet. It says on your site that, or you told me earlier rather, you said you wanted to look for the noble side of the person and what drove him when you made this. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that at that time, I mean, we're going back over 20 years, and even from the onset of the project, it was probably a good 3 years before I ever really started the monument, because there was a lot of fundraising that was involved. There were a lot of hurdles to get through, and when I looked into what was happening with baseball, the ballparks were taking a big turn, and they were all being sort of upgraded into something new, like a whole new entertainment.
Right.
And I wasn't looking to do something that was trophy-like. I wanted to do a real statue or sculpture that looked into Babe Ruth as a person, not just as a guy swinging a bat.
Right.
And because it seemed to me that this had to speak for generations. And when you do a monument of someone, it's your novel. It has to include the subtleties of what you're trying to say. It's not just, this is a guy, in motion, but this is a man who has a myriad of qualities.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so I have him looking north to his future, which really was in New York. I have a look on his face of what I think is determination. He was young. It was all new to him when he was 18 years old. It was a big jump for him to go from being, at the industrial school for boys.
St. Mary's, yeah.
Mary's Industrial School for Boys to Jack Dunn's Baby.
Right.
Where he was respected.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
That's where I really started looking how I would depict somebody like that. And so, like I said, what I envisioned as the sculpture was that, yes, he was the greatest left-handed batter. He's leaning on his bat with his left hand. On his right hand, he's holding what at that time was a fielder's glove, which is what they used at the time.
Right.
From hand to hand.
Right.
But he was a great pitcher. People don't know that so much about Ruth, but I wanted to demonstrate just in those few things that I could add to the sculpture what his range was.
Right.
He was a great pitcher, and he was a guy with his future ahead of him, and that was what I wanted to say about him.
So you started as someone who had never been to a baseball game, and then you do this, and I imagine over the years you've learned a lot about Babe Ruth. What have you learned about him as a person?
What I loved about him was the larger-than-life character that he had. He had a disregard for convention, and I think that that's what makes someone great sometimes. He wrote his own book as far as what his life would be like.
Yes.
I think that the bravado, the fun that was within him, all of that is what made him who he was. And I loved reading about the cigars on the windowsills, and I even met some members of his family that I thought were wonderful people, and it just there was much there.
It's interesting you mentioned cigars, because the introduction to my book, Babe Ruth, the Superstar's Legacy, talks about a personal experience I had, an anecdote, where just by chance I met a man who was older at this time, who was a rookie with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1938 when Ruth came out of retirement to be their first base coach, and he told me, and he was just a young rookie, his name was Goody Rosen, and he told me he had the locker next to Ruth in the team's dressing room, Brooklyn Dodgers, and he used to be responsible for Ruth's humidor, where he kept his cigars. And he was telling me all these stories. It was quite a fascinating evening, to say the least.
I bet. So, yeah, I learned, it was an incredible journey to learn about him and his life, and quite an adventure for me to go down that.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned that this is probably your most well-known work, and you had one of your works here. I'm told it was presented to Prince Charles and Princess Diana on the occasion of their wedding in 1981. Is that right?
That's true.
Right. So, but
that is true.
Well, I was just going to say, but Babe Ruth, this is considered your most well-known major work?
Yes. Ruth is someone who's revered in Japan, all over the world.
Yes.
When a young sculptor and one of the guests who was invited from the United States, one of two actual invited guests from the United States, one being the Reagans, and the other being someone from the Revlon Corporation, Rita Lockman, whose husband was one of the owners of Revlon. She was a very close friend of Princess Diana's grandmother, Barbara Cartland, and she was invited to the royal wedding, and she amazingly bought this little sculpture from me
Mm-hmm.
and took it to England as a gift.
Okay.
And shortly after that, I received a letter from Buckingham Palace,
Oh,
not from the prince or anything,
Right.
but from some advocate explaining where my sculpture was being shown and so forth.
yeah. Oh, that's
And
impressive.
It opened
Yeah.
a,
Right. Okay.
well, it was funny because
Sorry, I didn't get that. Your just voice was cutting out for a second there. Okay, I just want to go back to Ruth. How has Babe Ruth changed your life?
well, at the point where I did that sculpture, it went from being, let's say, fine and rare, limited edition or single works of art, to doing a very mainstream sculpture
Right.
that, you can turn on Yankeeography to this day and they show pictures of it. It's been featured in The Wire television series. They have pictures of it on Maps magazine, all country, so forth. I mean, it's got a life of its own.
Pretty good exposure. Okay. Right. Right. Okay. What is it about Babe Ruth in terms of the legacy? As you know, my book gets into the legacy on many different fronts. It goes beyond sport and beyond baseball. What is it about Ruth that just seems to stand the test of time as an icon? What is it about him?
I think through the year, there's been so many people that have tried to meet what he achieved. And it seems to me that you could take somebody and put steroids and send them to a gym, spends 10 hours a day in it.
Yeah.
But this guy would hit that ball
Yeah.
and then smoke 10 cigars.
Right.
And the thing about that seems so magical and
Mythical?
and mythical.
Yeah. Well, they say, with the steroid era in baseball, which obviously has been a tarnish to the game, I guess, to a degree, about, players hitting home runs with performance-enhancing stimulants. And I always like to say that Ruth hit 714 home runs with performance-diminishing stimulants.
Right.
So sometimes the family might get a little upset over that because they think it's overplayed, and maybe it is. But if you saw the cover of the book, it's a photo that was taken in 1920 showing a real young, powerful Ruth, not the kind of guy
Right.
that was depicted in those films. And he looks like a guy who certainly could hit, 700 plus home runs.
Right.
So is there anything else in the baseball world that you see you'll be doing in your future?
Well, funnily enough, I just finished a monument of Lefty Grove.
What was that?
Finished the Lefty Grove monument.
Lefty Grove Monument, yeah.
So, for some never been to a baseball game, now I just finished Lefty Grove. It doesn't get installed into Western Maryland, where he was born, until 2019. But I literally just finished the monument about 2 months ago.
Yeah. Oh,
And
okay.
so I've had my share of baseball heroes that I've had the chance to get to know through the years by reading, learning, sculpting.
Right. Okay. The last thing I want to ask you about is the day. I understand when you broke ground on doing this work on Babe Ruth. It was February. It was his birthday, so it was pretty cold. But when it was May of, I guess, '96, you were there with Julia Ruth Stevens, Babe's daughter, to unveil it. What was that day like?
It was amazing for me. I mean, it was a culmination of years of work because, as I mentioned, there was winning the competition, doing the prerequisite model in order to even win that competition to get the job, working with the Babe Ruth Museum to get through the hurdles of the fundraising and everything that we had to go through to get the approvals to erect it in Baltimore City.
Right.
actually working with the New Arts Foundry, who is irreplaceable to me, that I work with to this day in Maryland, even though I don't live anywhere near there, but to getting that Babe Ruth monument created and erected. I forgot your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, Susan, I really want to thank you for joining us today, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again. And once again, thank you very much. You take care.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.